Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, President Trump declares trade wars are good, rattling Republican lawmakers and global markets, and prompting calls from other countries to retaliate. Then, caught beneath the bombs, hundreds are killed in Syria's eastern Ghouta region under a relentless attack by government forces. And it's Friday. Mark Shields and David Brooks are here to talk about turmoil inside the White House and the president's shifting stance on gun control. Plus, the world's highest paid actress, Jennifer Lawrence, speaks about her new film and gender disparities in Hollywood.
If we aren't paid equally, then why would women be expected to be treated equally? I think the power struggle, it's created a very sick dynamic in Hollywood that's very easy to take advantage of.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. Fears of trade wars with U.S. allies and other countries are escalating tonight after President Trump's promise to slap tariffs on steel and aluminum. There have been calls for the president to dial back his plan, and the rhetoric and threats are intensifying at home and abroad. The news of President Trump's decision made for rocky trading overnight in Asian and European stock markets. It also led to tough words from foreign governments. Now that President Trump has announced that he plans to slap a 25% tariff on steel imports to the U.S. and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports. France's finance minister put Washington on notice.
The United States should know that if these unilateral decisions are confirmed, they would call for a strong, coordinated, and united response from the European Union. All options are on the table.
They were backed up by the European Union, which said today that it would be ready to react.
The EU has been a close security ally of the US for decades. We will not sit idly while our industry is hit with unfair measures that put thousands of European jobs at risk.
China's foreign ministry raised concerns about other countries following the U.S. lead.
The U.S. adopting anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariffs in hundreds of cases of imported steel and aluminum products is to excessively protect their domestic products. If all countries imitate the U.S. approach, then this would have a grave impact on the global trade order.
And in Canada today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau warned that a tariff would be disruptive.
That's why we are impressing upon the American administration the unacceptable nature of these proposals that are going to hurt them every bit as much as they will hurt us.
For his part, President Trump dismissed the criticism. In a tweet early this morning, he referenced U.S. trade deficits and insisted that, quote, trade wars are good and easy to win. On CNBC today, his Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross defended the decision.
If we aren't the least protectionist major country in the world, please tell me who is. So what's really been going on is the other countries have been picking away at us, dumping materials in here, subsidizing their industries, and we haven't been fighting back.
But there was opposition building here at home, including among some Republicans. In a statement, Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse called the policy kooky 18th century protectionism that will jack up prices on American families and kill American jobs. That's what every trade war ultimately does. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who's been a dependable ally of the president, joined a GOP backlash. He said it would lead to the exact opposite outcome of the administration's stated objective, which is to protect American jobs. President Trump is expected to formally sign his tariff decision next week. He has not yet announced which countries will be named and which would be exempted. Worries about trade wars and interest rates sent Wall Street on more sharp swings. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 400 points before rebounding. It finished with a loss of 71 points to close at 24,538. The Nasdaq rose 77 points and the S&P 500 added 13. For the week, the Dow lost 3%, the Nasdaq fell 1%, and the S&P dropped 2%. In the day's other news, more questions arose about President Trump's calls for gun control measures. He met last night with the head of the NRA. Later, that official, Chris Cox, tweeted that the president and vice president support the Second Amendment, support strong due process, and don't want gun control. Today, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said the president's only promise to the NRA was that he'll continue to support the Second Amendment. Sanders also pushed back today against reports that National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster is on his way out. She said President Trump is happy with the three-star general, despite news reports to the contrary.
Look, General McMaster's not going anywhere. As the president said yesterday in the Oval Office to a number of the people, he thinks he's doing a great job and glad he's here.
Meanwhile, White House Chief of Staff John Kelly publicly defended his handling of the ouster of a top aide. Rob Porter resigned nearly a month ago over allegations of domestic abuse. Today, Kelly conceded some mistakes, but contrary to widespread reports, denied that he had known about the abuse much earlier. And he said, quote, "I have absolutely nothing to even consider resigning over." A powerful late winter storm roared across the northeastern U.S. today with wind gusts almost 80 miles an hour. Near record high tides and heavy rain triggered flooding, and the strong winds led to cancellations of more than 2,800 flights and halting of Amtrak train service. In Washington, powerful gusts shut down federal offices, museums, and other attractions.
It's just a really windy day. I did not expect this. It's like 70-mile-per-hour winds, and I'm trying to see the monuments by foot, which is a little crazy.
Parts of New York and Ohio got a foot of snow out of the storm, and all told, some 700,000 homes and businesses lost power. Heavy rain also fell across Southern California amid fears of new mudslides in areas burned bare by wildfires. People in Montecito had piled sandbags, fearing the kind of destruction that ravaged the town in January. But there was no major damage this time. Later, evacuation orders were lifted for some 30,000 people. In West Africa, Islamist extremists struck today in the former French colony of Burkina Faso. The attackers targeted the French embassy and army headquarters in the capital city, killing 8 soldiers and police. Thick smoke billowed from the army building as gunfire and explosions filled the air for hours. The French foreign minister praised the response.
L'ambassade de France a été assaillie.
The French embassy was attacked by a group of terrorists who were neutralized thanks to the actions of the police and the military personnel who protect our embassy. It shows we need to continue the fight against these groups with lots of strength and tenacity.
8 of the militants were also killed and more than 90 people were wounded. Later, the U.S. State Department advised Americans not to travel to Burkina Faso for now. The United States will not restore its embassy staff in Cuba to full strength. It was cut by 60% after unexplained health attacks that caused hearing loss and ringing in the ears, among other symptoms. Today, the State Department said it's making the staff reduction permanent. Back in this country, it appears the worst of the flu season has passed. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported today that the number of cases peaked in early February and is now declining. It is still unclear why this season's flu vaccine did not work better than it did. And the Reverend Billy Graham was laid to rest today after a funeral at the Graham Library in Charlotte, North Carolina. President Trump and Vice President Pence were among the 2,000 mourners who gathered under a large tent. Graham's son, Franklin, was the main speaker.
The Billy Graham that the world saw in the big stadiums was the same Billy Graham that we saw at home. There weren't 2 Billy Grahams. He loved his family. He stood by us. He comforted us. He left us an enduring legacy.
Billy Graham died last week at the age of 99. He was buried today next to his wife, Ruth, on their family property. Still to come on the NewsHour, the unimaginable destruction of a Damascus suburb that's still under bombardment. The retaliation women in the U.S. Forest Service face after reporting discrimination. Attempts to develop a coffee plant that can resist the effects of climate change, and much more. There was no let-up in the bombing or the suffering today for hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in particular suburbs of Syria's capital, Damascus. As Nick Schifrin reports, weeks of attacks in the eastern Ghouta area have killed hundreds, marking one of this brutal war's most brutal moments.
Among the ruined remains of eastern Ghouta, there are few places left to hide. After 7 years, the UN says there are no longer any words that can do justice to the destruction, the desperation, the children whose entire lives have been spent at war, the children who will die having known nothing but war. It was 7 years ago that eastern Ghouta was a green suburb of Damascus. It was one of the first places to rise up against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Today, the UN calls it hell on earth and the potential site of crimes against humanity. 400,000 civilians without food, water, or electricity. In the last 2 weeks, more than 650 civilians have been killed and thousands injured by Russian and Syrian planes. And a ground assault the Syrian military says is advancing and targeting rebel groups fighting the regime.
We are all civilians. Why are they dropping the barrels on us? They've terrified the children and destroyed our homes.
There's supposed to be a daily 5-hour ceasefire pushed by Assad's main ally, Russian President Vladimir Putin. And now President Trump is calling for a national 30-day ceasefire, but the firing has not ceased.
What truce? We are hiding in the basement. Russian strikes and barrel bombs, what truce? What sort of regime is this? God have vengeance.
There's supposed to be a humanitarian corridor manned by Russian and Syrian forces. The UN says not a single civilian has evacuated. The only corridors in eastern Ghouta today are traps.
Assad and his allies want the civilians of eastern Ghouta to walk into the arms of a regime that has been attacking them and starving them for the last 7 years.
On Ghouta's once busy streets, an ambulance is bombed out and abandoned. The humanitarian group Syrian American Medical Society, or SAMS, says airstrikes have destroyed nearly every medical facility, including a children's hospital. Local doctors operate without electricity or basic medical supplies.
The escalation has been night and day, and the staff have been working non-stop. The blood is flowing and the hospitals are overflowing with patients, and there are no places to evacuate them.
And in the basement, Dr. Hamza treats a terrified 13-year-old Mohammed Harwardi. He has injuries to his trachea, esophagus, and spinal cord. He is paralyzed from the waist down and is dying of starvation.
His heart under the skin directly because no muscular mass.
Aid groups say more than 1,000 people need immediate medical evacuations. Aid convoys still aren't given access.
All of these people, they do need life-saving evacuation. These people will die during the next few days if we don't take them out.
The White Helmets rescue groups accuses Assad of using chlorine. They say a chemical attack this week killed more than a dozen civilians, including a child. Syrian and Russian officials say chlorine attacks are by rebel groups. They call the White Helmets fake news and accuse rebels of trapping civilians and instigating the violence.
The U.S. and its allies are simply exploiting baseless allegations of toxic weapons use by Damascus as a tool of anti-Syrian geopolitical engineering.
The U.S., whose priority remains ISIS, responds with accusations that Russia has failed to ensure the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons and is Assad's enabler.
Its continued denial of the Assad regime's culpability in the use of chemical weapons is simply incredible.
Diplomatically and militarily, Moscow plays both arsonist and firefighter, fueling tensions among all parties in Syria, then serving as an arbiter to resolve disputes.
This week, Putin left the door open for further intervention. He told reporters Russia will not, quote, endlessly tolerate rebel attacks during the so-called truce. But for the residents of eastern Ghouta, there is no truce, and there are no longer any words. Only a father whose son survived, expressing relief, and a father whose son died, saying goodbye. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
Now to the latest on our exclusive investigation about sexual harassment and retaliation in the U.S. Forest Service. Last night, William Brangham and our team reported on allegations of misconduct we've heard from women across the country. The report also included stories of sexual assault. We have a closer look tonight at some of the retaliation these women faced over the years. But first, we have new information about complaints that allegedly reach all the way to the top of the agency. William is here again now with more. So, William, tell us more about these new allegations.
The allegations pertain to the very head of the Forest Service, a man named Tony Tooke. And the allegations, these were ones that we heard throughout the course of our reporting. They were allegations of sexual misconduct committed by him when he was not the chief earlier. And they involved relations with subordinates, is the complaint that we heard. Apparently, we had asked about this many times to the Forest Service, and very early this week, they said Tony Tooke has a perfectly fine employment record. That's all that they would say about this. After our stories aired last night, however, online and on the broadcast, we got a new statement from the Forest Service saying, in fact, an investigation into these complaints was underway.
So they are looking into this now.
That is right. In fact, we also heard from Tony Tooke himself this evening, and he said that he is cooperating with the investigation, he supports it, and he hopes to be treated in the same standard as any other Forest Service employee.
So thinking back to the reporting last night, you laid out so clearly the kinds of harassment and, as we said, assault that these women have been subjected to. It is such a hostile environment. Why do these women go into the Forest Service in the first place?
They love the work, honestly. Every woman we talked to loved the idea of the forest. They love the mission of the Forest Service. These are incredibly strong women. They're athletic. They love the challenge. They love working outdoors. They love fighting fires and axes and chainsaws. I mean, there's a lot of real sense of mission in the work that they do. But the environment that they work in is a very tough environment. It's a macho, male-dominated field. And if you had to create an environment that was sort of a ripe breeding ground for harassment, this is kind of it. You're far away from civilization. There's no human resources office nearby when you're fighting a fire. It's a tough environment to work in. And we talked and heard this from a lot of different women. In fact, one of the women we spoke with in our reporting is a woman named Janelle Wagoner. She's part of a class action complaint that's being made against the Forest Service, alleging gender discrimination. And she, in our interview, gave a very good description of what it's like to be a woman in the Forest Service.
I was put in the most remote place. I was forced to sit and watch porn movies because that's what you did if you wanted your job the next year. They dropped trees on my head, they put rocks in my pack, they destroyed my lunch, they did everything possible to wash me out.
Oh, so hard. The women you talked to, William, you told us, were fearful of speaking out. It was really hard for them to do. How did they overcome that? And you heard that a lot.
Oh, the fear was in almost every single person we talked to, people were very reluctant to speak out. In fact, one of our colleagues talked with a woman for a very long time on the telephone. She then called back later and said, please destroy the notes of my conversation for fear that they would somehow get out. One woman told us that after she reported retaliation, she had to go to the hospital. She was having what she felt like a nervous breakdown in response. So this was a very common thing that we heard. One woman we talked to named Darla Bush, she's also part of this class action complaint. She said that when she got pregnant, she was a very senior firefighter herself in the field. She gets pregnant with twins and her supervisor tells her immediately, you're useless to the Forest Service, and he tells this to her over and over and over again. When she complains about that, she says the retaliation got worse. Let's take a look at what she had to say.
Once you say something, there's no shutting that door and you get a target on your back. It's been my experience. If you open your mouth and you speak up in regards to your standards or what should be right or wrong, there's no going back.
In fact, last night after our program aired, we have put a tip line on our website. It's tipline@newshour.org. People can send us emails. And we heard from dozens and dozens of women, some in the Forest Service, some in other agencies, echoing this exact same theme, that when you complain about something in the Forest Service, you get hammered for it.
But at the same time, it's clear some women have felt they have to speak out. They've had the courage to do that. They think it's important. What is it that's driving them? Is it the Me Too movement, something else?
I think the Me Too movement absolutely has something to do with this, especially for younger members of the Forest Service. You see all these women in all these other industries coming out and talking about this, and that's infectious. I think also culturally we're just going through this moment where we are realizing that this kind of behavior is just not acceptable. That said, there are a lot of older women in the Forest Service who have been arguing and complaining publicly about this for years, and they're a little irritated that only now is the media starting to pay attention to it. In fact, there's a woman named Darlene Hall that we spoke to. Again, she's also in this class action complaint. Here's how she described this sort of retaliation.
This has been going on so long, and it's getting so big and so deep that it's not going to go away, and it's about time that it gets out there. And so people are held accountable because they haven't for years, all the way up to the top. And if we didn't stand up, you know, I would hope that other people would stand up because they're destroying a lot of people, a lot of good people.
So, William, you and your team throughout this process have been trying to get comments, reaction from the Forest Service. It's been very difficult to do that until just the last couple of days and just now.
That's right. Throughout the entire process, Judy, we asked the Forest Service, give us someone on camera to talk with us about this. They wouldn't provide anyone. Nobody would talk with us on camera. Off camera, an official said to us, we understand this is a problem. We are trying to fix it. We have set up a tip line where employees can call the Forest Service and make complaints. They're trying to standardize anti-harassment training for every employee. So until tonight, though, we didn't get a formal statement from them, which we just did as we went to air. This is an excerpt of what they had to say. The stories the Forest Service employees shared during the PBS NewsHour piece are important to hear, difficult and heart-wrenching as they may be. Stories like these have underscored that there are elements of sexual harassment in the Forest Service that have existed and continue today. We acknowledge that we have more work to do. The Forest Service is committed to permanently changing our culture to create the workplace we all deserve. So that's the part of the statement from the Forest Service. We'll post their entire statement on our website.
Post the entire thing online, and I know you and your colleagues are going to continue to keep an eye on all of this. William Brangham, thank you very much. Excellent reporting.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, Mark Shields and David Brooks weigh in on a chaotic week at the White House. And Jennifer Lawrence discusses her latest endeavor, playing a Russian spy. Now, how climate change might affect your breakfast habit. In his next installment in a series of reports from El Salvador, Fred de Sam Lazaro examines how coffee growers are caught in the middle of an industry affected by warming temperatures around the globe, forcing some to head for the cities or even to North America.
If you want to see what's driven tens of thousands of Salvadorians to leave this region, many for the U.S., come to this country's coffee-growing highlands. The Arabica beans from here were once a source of pride and 50% of the country's exports. But El Salvador's coffee crop was almost completely wiped out 5 years ago by a disease called leaf rust. Across Central America, some 1.7 million jobs were lost, and growers who survived must contend now with another threat that looms large: warming temperatures over the past 4 decades. A scramble is on to save this staple from what experts say is an existential threat.
This hybrid is very weakened by the climate conditions.
Benoit Bertrand leads a team of researchers at the industry-funded World Coffee Research, which is grafting new hybrid seedlings, trying to develop plants that can adapt to a changing climate.
So you're racing against time? We are racing against time, yes.
He was examining some hybrid plants on an experimental farm outside Santa Ana, El Salvador, and didn't like what he was seeing.
But you can see there, in this branch, for example, all the nodes are flowering in January.
Two months ahead of when they should be
2 months ahead, yes.
Early flowering means the plants must endure 2 more dry season months, lowering the bean quality even in hybrids like this one called F1, a sturdier variety first introduced to Central America 7 years ago.
This is the most vigorous plants that we can create today. So if this affects F1 hybrids, it's worst when affecting traditional varieties.
In this test field, there are 48 different families of coffee plants, each bred with different characteristics.
This one really, the vigor is not satisfactory for these conditions.
The leaves are not nearly as green, as verdant, and it just doesn't look as healthy. It's skinnier.
Yes, exactly. If the plant is healthy, they can resist. They can tolerate more and more the disease. And when the plant is really weakened by the climatic conditions, they cannot resist.
That's what's made Jorge Garcia's crop vulnerable to the rust disease. He and other growers blame the steadily rising temperatures in these highlands, hurting a plant that thrives in cooler conditions.
We never thought it would be as bad as it's ended up being.
How much did you lose?
Basically, we lost everything.
Garcia is a small farmer near Jayaca, about an hour west of San Salvador. The holes throughout his farm mark where coffee trees once stood. 15 miles away, Wilfredo Ramos heads a cooperative of 57 small coffee farmers. He says many of his members had to stop farming in the wake of the epidemic.
In order to survive, many of our wives had to move to the city and work domestic help, and the men had to find non-farm jobs.
Many are now in the process of trying to rebuild their farms. We watched as some of his members weighed their most recent harvest. Last year's crop was down 90% from pre-epidemic levels. Ramos thinks this year may bring better news. Still, he says, it's been very difficult.
We are having trouble getting credit from the banks, and since credit is limited, we don't have the money to explore new areas of production.
One organization that has been trying to help is Blue Harvest, a nonprofit run by Catholic Relief Services. It teaches farmers new methods to deal with climate change. Craig Kraft is one of the advisors.
What they're facing requires more knowledge and more tools. We're also promoting techniques that will lower the temperature, increasing the humidity of the soil through cover cropping, through mulching, increasing the amount of shade that's on the farm. All of that drives the temperature lower on the farm.
Blue Harvest is also encouraging farmers to branch out into new crops, something that farmer Jorge Garcia has decided to do.
We are now trying to grow cocoa. My expectation is that in 2 years we will be in a better position here at the farm.
But cocoa, which requires a great deal of water, isn't a perfect solution either.
That's where we have our renovations over there.
Some larger farmers, like Carlos Borgonova, have decided to completely renovate their fields, planting new coffee trees and adopting new techniques, like aggressively pruning trees to stimulate vigorous growth. For the last 2 years, he's also organized a conference of coffee growers, large and small, to try to develop and share best practices in the face of the growing threat.
So one of the major challenges we have is to make a coordinated effort as a country, all stakeholders that are in this, and push a renovation project, with these new varieties and agricultural practices that will allow us to produce more coffee and be sustainable over time.
Borgonova can afford new hybrid plants, and he's excited by the possibility of the second-generation hybrids being grafted here onto sturdier root systems in an attempt to breed more vigorous, disease-resistant plants. But that's not an easy solution for small farmers, says Blue Harvest's Craig Kraft.
These plants are expensive. It's 2.5 times of what coffee plants cost, and small farmers don't have access to credit. This represents an investment that takes 4 to 5 years to pay off. And so, I think that these hybrids have an incredible potential, but I would like to figure out how we can get these in the hands of smaller farmers.
Restoring El Salvador's coffee crop, which has now dropped to just 2% of the country's exports, is not only a matter of pride, Borgonova says, it's a matter of economic security.
It's a big creator of jobs. We used to employ close to over 300,000 people a year. Now we're down to 86,000. It's a way to prevent migration to cities and to prevent emigration to the United States and Mexico and Canada.
For consumers, coffee will always be available, but at what price, experts say it's hard to tell. And the key threat, they add, is to some of the world's highest quality beans, around which a multi-billion-dollar industry has evolved over the past 2 decades. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Fred de Sam Lazaro, outside Santa Ana, El Salvador.
Fred's reporting is a partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. It's been one more whirlwind week in Washington. Another high-profile departure from the White House, fresh scrutiny over the president's son-in-law, and an escalation in the war of words between Mr. Trump and his own attorney general. All this as the president made surprise declarations on trade and gun control. That brings us to the analysis of Shields and Brooks. That is syndicated columnist Mark Shields and New York Times columnist David Brooks. Welcome, gentlemen. So much going on this week. I barely know where to begin at the White House, Mark. The president's closest aide announced she's leaving. He has a son-in-law who's under a lot of scrutiny over alleged conflicts of interest. He has a chief of staff who is raising questions again about his how he handled the firing of an aide over domestic abuse, and on and on. The leaks seem to just be flowing a gusher every day. What matters in all of this?
What matters is chaos in the White House is bad for the United States and bad for the world. There is no rational order. I mean, for example, what you've described, the morale at the White House, from every report, is just incredibly low. To work in any White House, Judy, is an act of both self-sacrifice and self-interest. You miss birthdays, you miss anniversaries, you miss your children's recitals, but there's a sense of mission, a sense of history, a sense also that it's special. You're part of something special, you get status and recognition. All of that is missing here. This is a civil war in a leper colony. There is no sense of direction. The steel quotas being a perfect example. There was no preparation, tariffs rather. There was no preparation politically. There was no preparation for making a case. There was no preparation for the press. There was no preparation within the White House. There's nothing organization. It's all act on impulse and chaos and sort of the whim of the president himself.
There's almost a temptation, David, to look at all of this as some kind of sideshow, but there are real consequences, aren't there?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to think of historical parallels when we've had this much chaos in the American presidency. You know, Richard Nixon had some bad days at the end there, but he had a very high-quality staff around him. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. I'm going through the list. I can't think of anything quite like this, where we have the combination of a semi-competent or missing staff and an emotionally and intellectually unstable president. Reince Priebus, the former chief of staff, said in an interview not long ago that when you look from the outside, it's actually 50 times worse from the inside. And we're getting a glimpse of that. And one thing that leapt out at me, and I think this is the key thing, the most important thing, that it has real-world consequences. We're not just fighting over whether he has a military parade or not. The steel tariff thing is real consequences. And the word that leapt out at me, one of his staffers said, one of his allies said, he made the decision because he became unglued. And so we have a president who makes a decision because he becomes unglued, a decision totally in avoidance of the entire process. And then to combine the chaos of it, he issues a tweet this morning, which to me was a topper even by Trump standards, that a trade war is good and easily won, a concept that no economist of any stripe and no historian of any stripe could possibly think is anything other than crazy. And so it's extremely disorienting right now.
So how do we process this, Mark? It's the headlines. You could go in almost any direction every day over a new controversy or set of controversies at the White House.
I honestly don't know, Judy. I mean, it's overload. It really is. The one consolation, the one defense that the president's apologist and supporter says, he doesn't mean what he says. That's supposed to be the consolation, and don't be so concerned. One of the more plausible explanations for the impulsive imposition, keeping of a promise he's made for 30 years on steel tariffs, was that the 18th District of Pennsylvania is up in 2 weeks. The special election for a Republican seat that the Democrats have not even contested in 2014 and 2016, that Donald Trump carried southwestern Pennsylvania, blue collar, by 20 points. And the Democrat Conor Lamb, former Marine, former prosecutor, U.S. prosecutor, is even with the Republican nominee. And a defeat here would send such panic. This is Trump territory, and that this was seen as standing up for American jobs. That's the most plausible explanation politically. It's not a defense, but it's an explanation.
Panic into the ranks of Republicans worried about the fall midterm elections.
Yes, yes.
But David, I mean, if that's what he was trying to do, I think a lot of Republicans didn't get the message, because right and left they are today asking him to reconsider, saying this is not a good thing. We don't need a trade war. He's gone in exactly the wrong direction.
Yeah, well, Republicans have A, historical belief in free trade. B, a lot more people work for companies that use steel than work for companies that make steel. And so everybody who uses steel is hurt. Those few who make are helped. Now, this is not the first time that a Republican president has done this for political reasons. George W. Bush did it, and it was an economic disaster, and they repealed it. And he knew he was doing it for economic reasons, but at least George W. Bush did it within the context of trying to expand trade generally. He made this one buckle to give a special interest what it wanted, but he was trying to expand trade. The difference with Donald Trump is he just has a zero-sum mindset. It's very hard for him to understand trade because it's not a zero-sum game. There are winners or losers, but most people win. And he just has never thought that way. It's always, if somebody's winning, then I'm losing. And going back to the 1980s, he has always talked about that way in the zero-sum mentality. And that, I think ultimately, when he got angry at whoever he got angry and made this impromptu decision, that was probably in the back of his mind.
Can I dissent? And with all respect, trade, Judy, is a political issue. When a plant closes in a city, it takes away the payroll, it takes away the life, it takes away the dignity of people who work there. It takes away their futures. And that has happened all over the middle of the United States. When trade works to our advantage, it means you get cheaper T-shirts at Walmart, because the T-shirts can no longer be made in the United States profitably. So there is specific hurt, and there is specific help. And I think there is a political argument that can be made. Certainly when Sherrod Brown, the Democrat who's running for re-election in Ohio, supported the president, and Rob Portman, his Republican colleague in Ohio, was less than lukewarm. He was critical.
Well, it's a Democratic Party position.
Democratic Party's position that we have been, that the big picture, while it's worked and increased trade, that there have been casualties and indifference to the casualties sustained in the trade wars.
And I should say, you know, we're seeing that on trade, David. We're also seeing it to some extent on the question of guns. Here we are, a little over 2 weeks since that terrible school shooting in Florida. Those students went back to school this week. There's continued discussion here in Washington about what to do. No sign that anything is going to happen, and yet those students are saying, we're going to make these politicians pay if they don't do something about guns. The president, seems to me, has sent some mixed signals. He's talked about wanting to do something, but there's still no clear direction.
Yeah, well, from the president, it's whoever is in the room with him. He's pro-gun with the NRA, anti-gun with Dianne Feinstein sitting next to him. So that's just weather vane stuff. I think what's happened with the gun issue, it's bifurcated. Legislatively, it's pretty clear nothing's going to happen. It's gone through the Congress, and they've made it clear we're not doing anything. For people to get some actual realistic gun legislation, you had to pick off a few Republicans, get them away from the NRA position, and say, let's work practically. And you had to take the temperature down to do that. That has not happened. The temperature has ramped up. And so what's happened legislatively, I'd be very surprised if anything happened, because we're back in our polarized tribal war. But it's become a culture issue. Is their NRA destigmatized? Are gun owners destigmatized? So we sort of read them out of polite society. That's what's sort of happening this week with all these companies saying, we don't want you on our affiliation plans. And that's not about legislation. It's not even about gun control. It's about stigmatizing a certain belief system.
It really has moved in a way, Mark, into the private sector. I mean, into, people, companies saying, we're putting our values on the line here.
It has, Judy, in a way. I was surprised. I thought Newtown would do it. I thought the slaughter of the innocents in Newtown, but Parkland has had an impact, and I have to say, social media has really felt, had its impact felt, I think, by American corporations as well. I mean, that they cannot be morally neutral. It's one thing to get a letter from a consumer who's upset with your position, but when your website, all of a sudden, there's criticism raining down upon it, I think, and I give the corporations credit for taking a moral stand, in this case, Dick's Sporting Goods in particular, that, it's always easier to be neutral in these situations so you don't offend anybody, and I think it's different. I think the real test will be the march here in Washington. If, in fact, the social media is
coming
supported,
up this month,
March 24th, by hundreds of thousands of people really turning out, I think then there is a hope for a sea change on this issue. I mean, because it demands it.
The only caution I'd issue, I mean, I think corporations should be citizens of the country and they should follow a set of values. I am suspicious of concentrated power. Mm-hmm. Economic power is concentrated on the right, and we should be suspicious of it. Corporations want to take over and use their power to oppress. Cultural power is concentrated on the left, and concentrated cultural power can do great damage if a lot of people feel they are culturally intimidated. And many people have argued that the Trump presidency is a political reaction to a sense of a lot of people feeling they're trying to culturally silence me. And if it turns into that sort of cultural stigma across gun owners or against a culture rather than simply against an NRA policy, then that really ramps up the culture war another level, and it would have bad consequences.
Even if you're talking about relatively modest steps, raising the age when you can buy an assault weapon.
Well, I think that's the careful line that has to be won. If we say it's about raising the age or creating this program or banning this specific bump stocks or whatever, I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing. But if you're saying, as somebody said to Marco Rubio, I look at you and I see a mass murderer, then you're crossing the line. And then a whole group of people are saying, hey, wait a second, they're impugning my own character, my own values, my way of life, and that's when it begins to get dangerous. So to me, keeping the temperature down and talking about the specifics of what the legislation is trying to do, to me, that's the better way to actually go about this rather than ramp up the cultural war and the tribal war at another level.
I hear David, and I think
20 seconds.
20 seconds. I think there is a legitimacy. And a real legitimacy in taking on the National Rifle Association and corporations and institutions, whether it's Amazon, whether it's whoever FedEx, who give them special benefits and special prices. I think that's real. National Rifle Association is not the Second Amendment, and it is not sportsmen. It is a special interest, and it's a vile influence in the country.
And echoing in our ears the voices of those students saying they want to hold people to account if they don't do anything. Mark Shields, David Brooks, thank you both. Finally, with the Academy Awards coming this Sunday, Jeffrey Brown profiles one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Jennifer Lawrence. She's been making at least 2 films a year since the age of 20. And now at 27, she's the youngest actress ever nominated for 4 Oscars. In a year in which the industry's problems with discrimination and harassment have gotten as much attention as the films, Lawrence has been outspoken, especially on the issue of pay equity. She talked to Jeff about that and her new movie opening today.
I was told to take a man to a hotel. They said he was an enemy of the state.
It may be an old story, American and Russian spies, cloak and dagger, but the film Red Sparrow, set in the here and now, arrives with new resonance.
Instead, they cut his throat.
Jennifer Lawrence plays Dominika Egorova, a Russian ballerina turned agent forced into a sexually violent and deadly world. She says the role took her places she'd never gone as an actor.
There were a lot of things about this that kind of scared me. She was being put in physical situations that I was uncomfortable with, just me as a human. Yeah, me personally. And so it was actually really good for me to kind of put myself in a place, not ask my character to go someplace that I wasn't going to go. And I felt stronger afterwards.
Red Sparrow is loosely based on novels by Jason Matthews, a former real-life CIA operative. It features an all-star cast, including Jeremy Irons, Charlotte Rampling, and Joel Edgerton as an American agent.
Your uncle is a very powerful man.
In my country, if you don't matter to the men in power, you do not matter.
Hey, I'd like to see you again.
Why are we going to become friends?
Director Francis Lawrence, no relation to Jennifer, says he was surprised by how timely the Russian-focused plot turned out to be.
When we were developing it, we actually had conversations with the studio where we felt like this modern Cold War idea, the Americans and Russians, felt outdated and a little passé. But the world changed as we were making the movie, and so the movie has just become more and more topical. I still don't think it's a political film. I was drawn in by the human characters and by the emotion of it, and that's what's always driven me.
Take off your clothes. Your body belongs to the state. Since your birth, the state nourished it. Now the state asks something in return.
The emotion and the scariness Jennifer Lawrence referred to deepen as her character is trained as a Red Sparrow. Agents taught to use seduction to gain access to those deemed enemies of the Russian state. It's a taut thriller, but one that includes scenes of brutality and torture. It also called for Lawrence to appear nude, 4 years after she was victim of a hacking and nude photos of her were posted online.
And once I read the script, I knew that I had to do it. And then the only thing that was really holding me back was just I haven't really been wanting to be seen in a sexual way. I've just always been kind of uncomfortable with that.
It's very easy with a story like this to go too far, to become gratuitous, to exploit, which is not what I wanted to do. And so that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about.
So where do you draw that line? How do you?
Well, that's a complicated question with this. Well, what I wanted to do was make sure that every single moment that has an ounce of sexuality or nudity or violence was inherent in the narrative, that had very specific emotional values, that was pushing the story forward.
Her entire story is people trying to use her and take advantage of her and try to train her to use her body to get ahead, and she gets ahead by using her mind. I find it empowering.
Of course, issues of power, gender, and sex are also very much of the moment in Hollywood and beyond right now, in ways that Jennifer Lawrence has felt compelled to address. Beginning with 2010's Winter Bone, the 27-year-old has built a reputation as a brilliant actress as well as box office star. The Hunger Games series, 3 of them directed by Francis Lawrence, established her as an international celebrity and an icon of a strong female character. Don't you worry about a thing. She won an Oscar for Best Actress for Silver Linings Playbook and was the highest paid actress in the world in 2015 and 2016. But a leaked memo revealed that on the film American Hustle, Lawrence and co-star Amy Adams earned much less than their male counterparts, Bradley Cooper and Christian Bale. She published an essay that helped jumpstart a conversation about pay equity.
My point of view on that essay was really just my own mentality on the whole thing. Why did I not feel like I deserved to be paid equally? I was more interested in that. And even though I have kind of a weird job that's probably not relatable to most, I felt like my mentality on that, if I'm feeling this way, in Hollywood, I can't imagine how many women across the world must be feeling that. Why don't we? I had won an Oscar by the time I was doing American Hustle. I had led movies to be #1 at the box office. Right. I was just curious, why did I not feel like I deserved equal pay?
You asked yourself, and then you asked the world.
And then I asked women.
Yeah. What about in the Me Too moment? Did you ask yourself similar types of questions and feel like you had to speak out?
I felt like it was important to show support, because that's how all of these people who have suffered abuse felt comfortable coming forward, was because of this outpouring of support. And then also, we had to start creating a movement. We have to reshape the way that we're treated. Things that were normalized before are no longer going to be normalized.
Did it surprise you?
No, it didn't. It didn't surprise me. I think there's a huge gap between the amount of men and women that are working in higher level jobs and decision-making jobs. And it's something that just has to change.
One thing that all exposed for the world was this sort of power imbalance in Hollywood, right? How serious a problem is it when you're a young actor?
That a young actor or a less experienced actor doesn't have the same opportunity, the same power to say no. So
To say no,
it
whether
creates
it's pay or
whether it's
harassment.
pay or yeah, they want to work, and so they don't have the same power to walk away from a job. So they don't have the same negotiating power. And again, I go back to if we aren't paid equally, then why would women be expected to be treated equally? I think the power struggle it's created a very sick dynamic in Hollywood that's very easy to take advantage of.
Jennifer Lawrence is asserting her power these days on and off screen. Red Sparrow opens today around the country. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in Washington.
Later tonight on PBS, Frontline presents a film co-produced with the BBC on Harvey Weinstein. The documentary takes an in-depth look at allegations against the powerful movie producer and includes interviews with new accusers and a former company executive.
It was on the front page of the New York Post, and those of us that heard about it and read it kind of looked at each other. I don't think anybody was too surprised.
Tom Prince, an executive who left the company last year, is speaking out for the first time. No current executives would agree to an interview. Prince says he had become concerned about Weinstein's use of company funds to fly women around the world.
Pretty much on every production, I would get a phone call or an email saying, we have to fly an actress to the movie set. And I would always come back and explain to them that this is a 1 or 2 day role. And, you know, we're spending an awful lot of money flying somebody from Paris to Philadelphia or from New York to New Zealand to fulfill a role that could be occupied by a local resident there. But this was a mandate from Harvey. It was the company that was completely and utterly ruled by Harvey, and Harvey was a dictator. I thought clearly there was something more than the actress's acting abilities involved with us flying somebody and spending $20,000 on a role that would have cost $2,000.
In his response to Frontline, Weinstein denied this and said that he and Prince repeatedly clashed over budgets and other production issues.
Frontline's Weinstein airs tonight on most PBS stations. And now Robert Costa is preparing for Washington Week, which airs later tonight. So Robert, what's on tap?
Tonight on Washington Week, we'll discuss the turmoil inside the West Wing and why President Trump welcomes a trade war with some of our closest allies. That's later tonight on Washington Week.
And we will be watching. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Have a great weekend. Thank you and good night.
You're watching PBS.